I think it would be safe to say that the majority of people that are grieving a death or some other type of loss even, but I'm going to mainly focus on death. I think the majority of people just harbor such horrible, horrible guilt.
All right, welcome everyone to podcast number 191, Renew Your Mind. With us today, we have Senior Pastor Paul Gruenberg. We have our Youth and Family Director / Contemporary Band Leader, Julie Kettlewell. We have retired Pastor Barry Sweet. We have our Pastor Jeremy Touroo. Myself, Dana Hall, is the moderator, and we have our special guest, Julie Kettlewell, and I will let her introduce herself as our podcast. It's going to be on grief today. We're going to continue with some of our discussions that we had previously. So, Julie?
All right. Thank you, Dana. My name is Julie Kettlewell, and I am a certified grief educator. And what that means is I do the best job I can in trying to raise the bar on grief literacy in our society, because the fact is we live in a grief illiterate society. And what that means is people just don't understand it. Because they don't understand it, they don't talk about it. And when you don't talk about it, you can't heal it. And so what we need to do is normalize that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my goal.
That is exactly what we talked about when we had Jesse on here about how we didn't spend enough, as a society, we don't spend enough time grieving.
Well, we don't know how to.
We don't know how to. We just want to blow by it. And but I think one of the topics you wanted to talk about was battling guilt and grief.
Guilt is a huge component in grief. I think it would be safe to say that the majority of people that are grieving a death or some other type of loss even, but I'm going to mainly focus on death. I think the majority of people just harbor such horrible, horrible guilt. For one reason or another, could be anything. They could even create something.
Well, one of the things I think of in terms of that in practical ways is I said something and I can't say I'm sorry.
You can't unsay it. Yep.
Yeah.
You can't take it back. And that's a big part of it. And that's where guilt and regret kind of go hand in hand, but they're not exactly the same thing, but they do feed each other. So you can take a regret that you might have, and you can use it to feed your guilt. And then when it becomes guilt, it takes on a life of its own. Because regrets, you can learn to live with regrets very easily. They might not very easily, but you can live with them. They might pop into your head and you talk to yourself for a minute and go, okay, yes, I regret that, but I can't change it. I'm just going to move on.
Mm-hmm.
With guilt, it's just not that easy because it does all the talking and it does all your thinking for you, because it changes the way you think. Because what happens is, particularly if it's been a traumatic death or if you're suffering from complicated grief, that there's many components.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there.
Okay.
So you're talking complicated grief. What is just grief?
Geez.
Or so what is complicated grief?
Well, we'll get to complicated, but what's grief?
Okay, grief is, oh gosh, I don't know if I have just a simple definition, but it's
I would say
just
there probably isn't one.
There probably isn't one, but
Probably
it's
not.
just, suffering through the loss of someone you've loved or something that was important to you. And it is true mental and emotional suffering, and often affects your physical well-being. It affects your work life, your home life, your church life, your all parts of your life.
So grief could surround a loss of a job, a loss of a
anything.
friend moved away. We feel the
Mhm.
blues when we send our kids off to college or
Yep.
they move out of the house. There's that period of grief. So grief is a real natural aspect of just living life.
Yes, everyone grieves. And, it's safe to say at any given time in any venue you're at, whether it's at home, at work, at church, in this podcast, everyone here has either suffered some serious grief or is currently in some level of grief. So I'm going to go further with that.
So
To
this is
say
the
that-
complex.
Well, complex grief is different. The complicated grief, that's when there are several different components all actually piling onto that grief, which just makes it worse and blows it up not beyond healing, but makes the healing so much harder.
What other what
I
other
would say get you to a
components?
place where you're not functioning any longer,
Oh,
or
well,
not
now
able
we're
to function.
Now we're talking about prolonged grief. That is now an actual mental health diagnosis. So you just opened up a big can of
Wait.
worms here,
Before we
Pastor.
go to
Can
the
you
can
go
of worms,
back?
then, yeah.
Can you go back? You said there was several components besides guilt. What's one of the components
of
Grief.
of the
grief.
traumatic?
The traumatic grief. Now that, again, if let's say that a person is in a horrible car accident, as opposed to another person, you're comparing one death to another death, is 98 years old and they eventually passed away. Okay, that one you don't see as so traumatic. The elderly person who, literally they've been alive a long time and it was expected. The traffic accident, another whole thing. It's a trauma. It hits you in the head. You can't accept it. You can't deal with it. And you just can't let it go. In fact, well, I guess I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself on that. The guilt comes when we want to take on responsibility for that death. Okay, you can't really take responsibility for that 98-year-old person dying. There were probably a lot of very natural things that happened that led to that death. But let's say, for example, let's say I make a date with my girlfriend to go out to lunch. And I say, I'll pick you up. And she says, great. Next thing you know, I get behind schedule. The phone rings. I can't get off the phone. And next thing you know, I'm late. So I call her and say, I'm really running late. She says, no problem. I'm going to start walking. It's not that far. She starts walking. A car comes down the road, veers off, hits her, kills her. I believe it's my fault. I tell myself it's my fault. If I had gotten off that telephone, if I hadn't been late, my best friend would still be alive. We know that's not true. I mean, realistically, if you challenge that thought, you will finally come to the conclusion that that was an accident. Accidents happen. That phone call and your lateness did not cause your friend's death, but you carry that guilt. And then what happens is guilt is a way of, it's our armor. It's a way of protecting us from the actual tragedy that took place or the actual feelings of just overwhelming loss from a death. And you just can't deal with it. So you create this guilt story. And that's your story and you're sticking to it. So you might not remember all the little pieces of what happened. So you might just plug something in there. Or in order to protect yourself, you tell the story, your version of the story, which is, it was my fault. Had I not, and it doesn't matter if the doctors tell you, your friends tell you, the family tells you, your pastor tells you, it was not your fault. You need to let this go. It's just not that easy to do because you have taken that story on as truth. Okay, and this is one of the hardest things, I think, for grief support facilitators or grief counselors to do, is to try to move somebody out of that thought process because they have embedded it into their brains and they are taking responsibility because it is so much easier to feel guilty than to feel helpless. And there was nothing anyone could have done about that death. And, you go through the what ifs and what if I had done this? What if I had done that? Well, okay, now you're moving out of your lane into God's lane. And we would never know the answers to that.
I was just gonna say, with the way you're describing it, I'm not saying that guilt or grief is pride, as to say that guilt or grief is like sinful, but I think that's the way you're describing it sounds like a natural outgrowth of our inherent tendencies to be me-centered.
Yeah, we want control.
Right. And if we can't let go of that, if we take on that much responsibility as though we actually had some sort of control over life and death, we're putting ourselves into God's realm, not our own.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
I was just thinking about that. That seems like a control thing.
It is.
To say, okay, I've suffered this tragic loss. I must assign a reason for this.
That's right.
I must.
Because you don't want to feel
fit
helpless.
in a category, right? It can't.
Well, that helps us make sense of it.
Right.
That's right.
Is giving reason to it. We want to make sense of it because that's part of wrapping our brain around it.
That's
Even
right.
if what we're doing isn't correct. That's how we cope.
And it's usually all wrong, but you do what you have to do because that's your armor. That's your protective armor because grief is so absolutely overwhelming that it really can put somebody into a total state of inertia. They can't function. They can't take care of their normal everyday things that you would think, well, what's the problem? Why can't they do that? Because it's mind numbing and it stops us mentally, physically, in every way. And so, we need something to help us get through our everyday life as best we can. So we put on that armor and we carry that guilt for everyone. We carry it for everyone. We are the reason. And I'm so sorry, everyone, that person died. It was my fault. So you can all rest assured it wasn't you. But something in our heads tells us, well, that's the right thing to do. I'm going to take responsibility for this. And it gives me a feeling of control and a reason why. And it's so ridiculous, but it's so hard to undo that because in order to do that, number one, you have to really tread carefully, like as a counselor or a facilitator, and know when it might be time to start poking some holes in that story. Because when someone is committed to that story, the events in the story might be very, very different. The actual events, but that person's telling their story. And you can't just tell them, does that really make sense? Do you really believe that? That sounds a little far-fetched because now you're just going to throw them into another whole state of turmoil. You have to wait until they're ready and kind of just talk about the story. Get them to talk about their story and in some way, each time you talk about it, maybe look at one element of that story and go, what if it had happened this way? What if it had happened? And present some what ifs.
So I'm gonna let's get to a practical scenario. So I'm 21. I think I'm 21. My grandfather's 72. He at 47, he had a massive heart attack and went to Cleveland Clinic. And so has been living the heart smart life for a long time. At 21, my grandmother calls me, says, "Hey, and it's spring, well, it's winter break at college, says, "Hey, I can fly you down if you can fly yourself home." It's down in Florida. Went down to Florida for a week. My grandfather and I went and played shuffleboard. He was a shuffleboard champ in Florida. And we're riding back from shuffleboard on bikes. Now, I'm 21. I've been road riding a bike. And so, I'm just like going along, and we get home and my grandmother says, "Bill, your lips are blue." And I figured out, he's trying to keep up with his grandson on a bike, and he shouldn't be riding that hard. Okay. So that's the situation. A month later, my mom calls me and said my grandfather's died. And so the guilt is that I pushed my grandfather beyond what he could physically.
It was the bikes.
It was the bikes. I pushed him too hard. I didn't know I was doing that. So there's that scenario. There's a sense of guilt. Now I've worked through this, but what would you say? What would you say to me? I caused my grandfather's death. How would you get me away from that guilt or move me into that? How would you poke holes?
And you said he already had a heart situation.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a couple of tools that counselors and therapists use to negate those stories that we tell ourselves. Well, and the one concept is one that's often used in the medical field is, when you're trying to find out why someone died, you, through process of elimination, you finally get down to the one that makes the most sense. The proximal causation of that death was, with the 98-year-old was, her heart stopped beating. And you could look at a whole bunch of different things over the years, but at that time of death, that was the most obvious reason.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then you look at the situation with your grandfather. He already had a heart situation.
Mm-hmm.
You were not aware that putting him on that bike would eventually lead to that. You had no way of knowing that.
Mm-hmm.
He had no way of knowing that, or obviously he wouldn't have done that. And so you just have to talk to the person who is telling this story and just start asking them those questions. Like, this happened and this happened and this happened. But with his heart condition, do you think that it might be more likely that was the reason and could have happened even if you weren't there in Florida?
Mm-hmm.
It could have happened with him walking down the street. And then you start asking questions to get the person to go, well, I suppose that would be possible, but, and so you give them that one but to hang on to until the next time you go, well, but have you thought about this? And then there's another theory called Occam's razor. And that theory states that it's usually the simplest and most obvious thing that is the reason for this.
Yeah.
Well, and as soon as you said that, I'm thinking, well, Paul, he had blue lips, but you said it was another month before he died.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened between the time you rode bikes with him and a month later when he died?
That's right. Could
So-
have been anything.
Do you really think you caused it?
Right.
Would you be that direct?
Well, I would if a person had reached a point that I thought they were willing to receive that.
Okay.
Yeah, they got to be open.
They got to
Otherwise,
be
it's-
open to it.
It's easy to just throw that wall up.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because anytime in early grief, if you start asking somebody those questions, they will be so furious with you, and they may get up and walk out, and now it's lose-lose for everybody. They've not been helped. You feel awful because maybe should have waited on that a little bit, but mainly they haven't been helped.
Mhm.
And so you really have to know a person pretty well and know their story pretty well. And then as you start poking holes in that story, little by little, they will start to see how their story really didn't make sense and how, well, maybe I kind of made that part up just because I just couldn't face the reality of it, which that's known as confabulation, when you just fill in the blanks with what you think is going to work. And it's not a lie. These people are not lying when they tell these stories. They are just protecting themselves.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And
That's
so
an inner protection
it
that they're
is.
not really even aware of.
That's right. That's right. We tell these stories believing that we're telling the truth.
Mm.
Mhm.
And personally, I think that is probably one of the biggest steps in the healing process when you're healing from grief, which, by the way, I neglected to say earlier, you grieve for the rest of your life. There is no end date on grief. But it's such a process. And for some people, it moves more quickly. For other people, it can, that early grief, that really traumatic feeling, that numbness can go on for quite a while. But there, I got off on a rabbit trail. I do this to myself all the time.
We're so
but
helpful
healing,
and helpful.
Yeah, we're
You
so
could blame
helpful.
Pastor Paul.
Yeah.
He-
But yes, I
Yep.
know.
He rabbit trailed
You're on my list. Write that down. But yeah, when we can get to a point when we feel that guilt is starting to lift, that is a huge, huge step in the healing process, because from there, so many other things can start falling into place. And for example, we want to talk a little bit, we probably won't have time today, but we want to talk about grace in grief and gratitude in grief. And in my own experience and in my experience talking to others, if there's that really heavy grief story, that guilt story, it's really hard to see your way clear to find the grace in anything, to find the gratitude in anything, because you feel so alone. Guilt, grief in general will put a person into isolation, but that guilt, it puts them in there and it nails the door shut. You don't, because you feel like you are not even worthy to be out and about because you committed this horrible
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
You caused that person's death.
And there's
Why-
no way to find, there's genuinely no way to find any peace with that person's
No.
passing if you're carrying the weight of guilt
That's
with it. I
right.
mean,
Mhm.
that being able to shed that guilt, or at least, let's say there was even possibly a legitimate role that maybe something could have changed.
Mhm.
And as you talk about like the complex grief, I think about first responders, and because you can feel grief over the death of somebody you don't even know.
Right.
If you happen to be there at that moment where maybe you're trying to save that person and you couldn't.
Mhm.
2 years down the line, you might not even remember that person's name, but still be carrying the guilt and the grief of their
Mhm.
death.
Mhm.
Yes.
And until you can really start to work through the guilt, you can't even come close to touching being at peace with it.
Mm-mm.
I mean, that's a whole different project.
Right.
There's the guilt thing, and then there's trying to being at peace with the loss.
That's right.
There's just no. It's such a powerful feeling,
Mhm.
and you're right. It'll put you in a box and then just nail the lid onto it.
Yeah, it will. And you will never find that peace that you need to heal until you can release some of those other things that are holding you back.
Well, I was going to say, why don't we wrap it up there, and then we'll come back to our next podcast and talk a little bit more about
Right,
that. Does that
right.
sound
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I didn't mean to cut you
Oh,
off.
that's okay.
So we just want to thank Julie for joining us today. And we really thank our listeners for listening to Julie along with all the rest of us. So we come to you from the Gaylord Methodist Church. And we'd love to have you join us on Sundays. In person would be great if you can manage that. We have a traditional service at 9 a.m. and a contemporary at 10:45 a.m. If you can't come in person, you can view us via Facebook or YouTube. We also have Wednesday night services every second and fourth Wednesday of the month. So we invite you to come join us. If you have any questions, feel free to call the office at 989-732-5380, or you can Google us at Gaylord Methodist Church. And we just thank you again for listening. Thanks, everyone.